My name is Eupolion, and I am the son of Basileus Telestes. My story begins in the middle of the 8th century before Christ's birth. In those days when our home was filled with joy and peace, and I still did not know that fate could so cruelly turn a person's life upside down. On the day when my adventures began, a group of girls ran into the anteroom, and immediately their clear voices rang out in the megaron, like the chirping of swallows at dawn. "Little fidgets," grumbled my nurse Misa, not taking her eyes off her embroidery. "Running around like they're crazy, and who's going to finish the embroidery?" Misa was my father's slave, but she had grown up in our house, and she was treated like a family member. When my mother died a few days after my birth, Misa became my mother. She was always by my side. When they taught me to read, when I played in the yard, when I was sick, Misa told me fairy tales, sang lullabies, protected me from my father's anger when I misbehaved. Father never remarried because he didn't want there to be a stepmother in the house who could make me unhappy. Where did we stop? The nurse turned her face, wrinkled like oak bark, toward me. I sat on a bench at her feet, listening to my favorite story, at how the stepmother hated little Phrixus. I answered, though I knew this tale by heart. "So then," the nurse said in the singing voice she always used for ancient stories, "the evil stepmother decided to destroy Phrixus, and taking him to the temple, said to the priest, 'Misa, Misa.'" My sister Eurydice interrupted her. She was 3 years older than me. After her, other girls burst into the room, all red from running and with eyes burning with excitement. "You should see the embroidery!" "Gold on blue background," one of her friends chimed in, "like golden threads on the sea." "And the necklace," cried a third. "Little ducks with such tiny beaks, all in a row." Misa looked at them with displeasure. "Chatterboxes. Embroidery. Little ducks. I can't understand anything you're saying." But I was already interested. I got up from the bench and went over to Eurydice. "Where did you see this?" "A Phoenician ship arrived, and the sailors brought their goods to shore," my sister exclaimed, and her eyes sparkled even brighter. "Such amazing things! You've never seen anything like it." At the word ship, my heart beat faster. I had always dreamed of seeing a real ship that comes from across the sea, from distant lands where unknown fruits grow and amazing animals live. "I want to see the ship," I began to whine, tugging at my nurse's sleeve. "Little silly," the nurse said softly and stroked my curly light hair. "Why do you need a Phoenician ship? Now you'll hear about the ship Argo that sailed to the land of the Golden Fleece, Colchis." But I didn't want to listen to the familiar tale. I wanted to see a real ship, with tall masts and white sails, that had come from distant sea horizons. "I don't want to listen. I want to see," I almost moaned. "I want to see the ship and sailors, how they climb up the rigging." Misa looked at me and understood that I wouldn't calm down. She sighed and put down her embroidery. "All right," she agreed. "We'll go to the shore. But why did you run off without a hat? Your head will get burned." She took the little white hat she had sewn for me herself and carefully hid my curly hair under it. Then, taking my hand, she solemnly headed for the exit. The girls, getting ahead of us, ran outside with shrieks. I didn't know then that this hat would become my salvation. Then I couldn't imagine that in just a few hours my defenseless life would change forever, and the loving nurse who always protected me from all troubles would never again press me to her warm chest. When we left the house, the sun was already setting, coloring the sea in golden pink tones. Our bay, usually so calm and quiet, was today full of movement and life. Right by the shore stood a huge ship, the like of which I had never seen before. The ship was wide, black-sided, with 2 tall masts. Its steep bow was crowned with a gilded figure of a god or goddess, and the stern was curved like a goose's neck. Wide gangways had been lowered from the side to the rocky shore, along which people bustled with bundles and bales. "Nurse, come on, nurse!" I began, tugging at my nurse's hand. "What god is that on the bow? How should I know what gods the Phoenicians have?" The old woman brushed me off. "I don't even recognize all the Hellenic gods. Where do the Phoenicians live?" I kept asking. not taking my eyes off the amazing ship. Who knows? They wander all over the sea, Misa answered. But I sensed some anxiety in her voice. Misa! Misa! Why is the deck empty? Where's the helmsman? Where are the sailors? Why isn't anyone climbing the mast? Probably sleeping, Misa suggested. They're tired and sleeping. It's quiet here in the bay, but in the open sea it rocks. We were approaching the ship. 3 Phoenicians stood near the gangway. Dark-haired, bearded men in loose, colorful clothing. One of them was weighing silver that Eurydice had brought him on small scales. She was trying on a necklace with tiny ducks, while the other girls admired it on her neck with sighs. The Phoenicians smiled widely and welcomingly. Their faces seemed kind, and their eyes sparkled with pleasure at the sight of our silver coins. But for some reason, the nurse stopped about 10 steps from the ship and squeezed my hand tightly. "We won't go any further," she said to me in a half-whisper. "You have to stay away from strangers." "Why stay away?" I was surprised. "Look how they're smiling." And indeed, the Phoenicians looked like completely peaceful traders. Just at that moment, another Phoenician appeared on board. He held something small in his hand that glittered in the sunday. "Look, Misa," I pointed. "A little ship. It fits in his palm with a mast and red sail, and even a little god like the real one on the bow." "Nurse, buy it for me." The Phoenician heard my words and spoke in broken Hellenic. "No need buy. Just take. I have same little boy. I love little boys. You hear, nurse?" I pulled my nurse by the hand. "He's giving us the little ship. He's a good man." Misa hesitated. She apparently also liked the toy, but something in the Phoenician's behavior made her wary. However, I could no longer contain my childish impatience. "Come on, nurse. Let's go quickly." I pulled my nurse toward the shore. She hardly resisted. After all, the toy really was beautiful and masterfully made. The man with the little ship was already coming down the gangway, smiling wider and wider. We walked toward him, and I felt my heart beating with joy and anticipation of the gift. But suddenly the smile on the Phoenician's face changed. He bared his teeth maliciously, and some animal cunning flashed in his eyes. In one leap he was beside me. From behind came the screams of Eurydice and the other girls, who scattered in all directions. The Phoenician grabbed me with strong hands, and Misa rushed to save me. But other pirates were already running from the ship. The Phoenician couldn't manage the nurse. She fought with all her strength, screaming and scratching like an enraged cat. 3 more came to help him. In one moment they dragged the old woman along with me onto the deck. The gangway flew up. People roared on deck. The oars rose and fell with a whistle. The ship moved away from shore, and a moment later it was already racing toward the exit from the bay, leaving behind the shore where my relatives stood, where my home was, my carefree childhood. From the deck I could see the commotion on shore. My father ran out of the house with servants. Hearing the girls' screams, Eurydice pointed toward the ship, and father stretched his arms toward the sea, as if he wanted to stop the ship with the force of his will. The pirates tried to tear me away from my nurse, but I clung to her with all my strength. Finally, they succeeded. Misa's plump body flew overboard and disappeared among the waves. The last thing I saw was her gray head, which instantly vanished in the sea foam. The ship continued to move away and soon disappeared from the sight of all who remained on shore. Much time passed before I recovered from the shock. When consciousness returned to me, I was lying on the deck by winding stairs that led down somewhere. All around was only sea. Endless, cold sea that separated me from home. On a pile of ropes sat the same Phoenician who had lured me onto the ship with the little boat. His bald head gleamed in the sun, framed at the back with curls. He was smiling, apparently rejoicing that I was alive and unharmed. Seeing that I had come to my senses, he approached me and extended his hand, as if wanting to comfort me. But instead, with 2 fingers he squeezed my cheek so hard that my teeth showed. From pain and offense, I tried to bite his thick, hairy palm. But the Phoenician, anticipating this movement, pulled his hand away in time. "Well," he said, and there was an ominous undertone in his voice, "those who bite get this." He pointed to a thick leather whip lying on the deck. At the sight of this terrible instrument, I shuddered. "Do you know how slaves are punished?" he asked, looking me straight in the eyes. Yes, I knew about this. A few years ago, when my nurse and I were passing by the stable, I heard terrible screams coming through the closed gates. "Nurse! They're killing someone in there," I had cried then. "Let's go away from here, my dear. They're punishing a slave," Misa had answered. "Can they punish me too?" I had asked. "You?" The nurse had been surprised. "You're not a slave. You're the Basileus' son." But now I was far from home, and my father couldn't protect me. Suddenly the Phoenician grabbed the whip with one hand and me with the other and dragged me down the stairs. My heart stopped with fear. What was he going to do with me? On the lower deck, the Phoenician released my hand. I saw a row of half-naked men raising and lowering oars. Their faces were exhausted, and their bodies covered with scars from beatings. Swinging the whip, the Phoenician took a few steps and suddenly brought it down on the bare back of one of the rowers. A black welt appeared. The unfortunate man didn't scream, but only bowed his head over his oar. The Phoenician raised the whip again and brought it down with force. A black cross swelled on the rower's back. "That's how slaves are punished," the Phoenician breathed, approaching me. "Understand?" I stared at him with wide eyes, unable to say a word. "I'm not a slave," I finally managed to whisper. "I'm the son of Basileus Telestes." "Telestes' son?" the Phoenician exclaimed, and his face suddenly changed. "Then why didn't you speak, you wretch?" throwing the whip at my feet. He ran up the stairs. In a moment I heard voices. The foreign language was incomprehensible to me, but the word Melek was repeated most often, which I later learned meant king or prince. The Phoenicians began to argue. Apparently some wanted to kill me, while others wanted to sell me or get ransom for me. Then my Phoenician, I guessed he was the leader on the ship, said something short and weighty. Everyone fell silent. Thus ended my first day on the Phoenician ship, the most terrible day of my life up to that point. It was as if some giant whirlwind had torn me from my native home, separated me from my nurse, father, sister. I found myself at sea among terrible people who reminded me of cannibals, about whom the blind bard sang in winter, strumming the strings of his lyre. It was a song about the adventures of Odysseus, whom my father considered his ancestor. This Odysseus got into the cave of the cannibal Cyclops, put out his eye and escaped from the cave under the belly of a ram, I thought. Of course, Odysseus was strong and brave, but I'm small and weak. Besides, the goddess Athena helped Odysseus, interceded for him in the council of immortal gods, and came to his aid whenever he was in trouble. But who will help me? I began fervently whispering the words of prayer that my nurse had taught me. I prayed to Poseidon, in whose domain I now found myself, promised to sacrifice 10 white bulls to him if he would send a strong wind and drive the ship to the familiar bay. Home. I was awakened by snoring. Someone was snoring with whistling and howling, and this snoring reminded me of the howling storm I had asked Poseidon for. Probably. Hypnos sends such snoring to seafarers because they live among waves and winds. I remembered my nurse, who always slept quietly, breathing inaudibly. She was kind and gentle. But how did I end up here? I had prayed to Poseidon on that deck where the rowers were, so they had carried me here while I was sleeping. I got up and examined my new dwelling. The little room was 6 paces long and 4 wide. The door was locked from outside. Seeing a wide crack between the boards, I understood that to my right was the room where the Phoenician, probably the helmsman, slept. Out of boredom, I stuck a reed I had found on the floor into the crack and pushed it all the way through. Suddenly the snoring stopped, and someone grabbed the reed so firmly that it couldn't be pulled back. "Is that you, Basileus' son?" came a voice from behind the wall. "What's your name?" "Eupolion," I answered. "Listen, Eupolion, try to escape. I'll tie you to an oar like those others. You'll sleep here. I allow you to go out on the upper deck where there are no rowers. Don't approach the side, or a wave will wash you away. Try to stay in my sight all the time, otherwise suddenly, and with this crack. That was a good idea. Here! A cake appeared in the crack. It was hard and smelled of burnt oil. But I didn't notice this. I hadn't eaten anything since yesterday morning. Soon I went out on the upper deck. Gray birds circled over the white crests of waves with sharp cries, almost touching the sea with their wings. The ship began to rock very much. The sky was quickly covered with spotted clouds, and it began to look like the skin of an animal that covered my father's bed. I caught the helmsman's anxious glance cast at the sky. At his command, the sailors began to furl the sails. In a minute it became completely dark. Waves like giant rocks rolled onto the ship, and it would fly up and then fall down. I felt my way down to my little room. There I knelt and began to beg Poseidon to calm the wind. But instead the storm only intensified. The ship rocked harder and harder. Waves beat against the sides with such fury that it seemed they would break out the planks and burst into the hold any moment. Suddenly I heard water pouring. It was flowing from somewhere above, perhaps through the opening for the ladder, or maybe through the openings for the oars. Cold seawater reached my feet. It was rising rapidly. To escape it, I jumped onto the bunk and pressed my back against the wall. Water swirled on the floor, and when the ship heeled over, I felt cold spray on my face. "Poseidon! Save me!" I cried, but my voice was drowned in the general roar of the storm. It seemed that a mast had been knocked down on deck. Right after this blow, the ladder creaked under heavy steps. I heard a wooden cover fall, then light hammer blows. Probably the Phoenicians are plugging the cracks, I thought. Soon it grew lighter. A bright spot approached me, and now I could make out a hand holding a lantern and the helmsman's bald head. When the darkness in the little room cleared, I saw a huge rat on the bunk next to me. It was shaking off water, hanging down its long tail. I screamed with horror, and again everything was swallowed in darkness. When I woke up the next morning, the sun was shining brightly, illuminating the nearby shore with the split peak of a snowy mountain. I remembered everything that had happened to me like a terrible dream. Laughter came from the bow of the ship. What a Basileus' son! He wasn't afraid of the storm. He was afraid of a rat. The helmsman was peering at the shore. His tired, aged face still had an expression of commanding power. His deeply hidden eyes, sharp, predatory eyes of a seabird, had spotted something among the rocks. Had he seen new prey there, or danger threatening the defenseless ship? The black oars rose and fell slowly, only 5 oars instead of 20 on the side where I stood. I remember the bare back with the black cross swollen on it. Cruel sea, I thought. Cruel people. Sailors who kidnap people, beat and throw rowers overboard. Whether the whip is in your hands or it walks on your back, but someone, so the ship doesn't stand still, must raise and lower the oar, while another is destined to stand on deck, steer the ship by the stars, and, foreseeing danger, fight storms. Poseidon, I muttered to myself, make me a helmsman. Let these Phoenicians raise and lower oars. Put me over them. After all, I'm a Basileus' son. Basileus' son! To the hold, came the helmsman's voice. Without thinking, I rushed to the stairs, and there I was on my bunk again. From loud orders in a foreign language and the stamping of feet, I guessed that the ship was approaching shore. Soon I heard the splash of an anchor and sounds of Hellenic speech. The helmsman was talking with someone on shore. At first, the voice of the person the helmsman was talking to was barely audible. Then it came closer. Obviously, the speaker had sailed up in a boat. What a beating the storm gave you, said the Hellene. As much as it wanted, the Phoenician replied, but the vessel is whole. We say, as long as the belly is whole, hands will grow back. Don't you know anyone who could help us? I'm a carpenter myself, and my sons will help me, but wood is expensive now. I won't spare money if you can manage it in 5 days. Meanwhile, I'll buy some oil and look for slaves to put on the oars. Give me half a talent. I'll put up masts for you. Stretch the yards. I know this work. I've launched more than one ship. I see you're a joker. My whole ship cost 1 talent. In Tyre you have forest nearby. But here to Syracuse wood has to be dragged from under Etna, as you wish. But I won't take less than 1/2 talent for the work, and 1/4 talent in advance. Hearing the words Syracuse and Etna, I shuddered with excitement. I knew that Syracuse and Etna were in Sicily. That snowy mountain I had seen was Etna. At home with my father, they often talked about Syracuse. Because this city had been founded by Corinthians a few years ago, I remembered the faces of Syracusans who had met with father. Maybe they remember me too? I thought hopefully. I'll start today, shouted the Hellene from the boat. And you don't need to look for oil. My brother Lammas sells it. You won't find better oil than his in all Sicily. He'll bring it right to you in amphoras. What should I do? I thought feverishly. Run out on deck? Shout. I am Eupolion, son of Telestes. Before the carpenter figures it out, the helmsman will strangle me and throw me in the hold. No, that won't work. I'll wait some time. Maybe I'll think of something. I'll wait until the carpenter and his sons are working on deck, and then... The solution came immediately. Write a letter and slip it onto the deck so the carpenter would find it. But what to write on? The helmsman won't give me papyrus, and what to write with? Where can I get ink? Among these heavy thoughts I fell asleep. But my sleep was troubled, full of terrible visions. When I woke up, it was dark in the little room, though axes rang clearly on deck. So it was still day. I jumped from the bunk and rushed to the door. It was locked. As soon as the carpenter and his sons came aboard the ship, the helmsman locked the door. But at night, when the workers leave, they might let me out. And by that time, everything must be ready. I began feeling first along one wall, then along the other. Then I felt the door and cried out with joy. A nail point stuck out from the opposite side. This is just what I need! Now I had to make ink. If only blood could be considered ink. Finding a stylus is easier. Any splinter will replace a stylus. I remembered the crack through which the helmsman had given me food. That's where I can pinch off a chip. There it is, a small piece of wood. All that's left is to replace papyrus, and then I grab my head. Of course! Here it is, papyrus. My nurse's gift. The hat! I seem to feel the touch of her hand, and hear her old voice. Your head will get burned. Good thing the hat is white. You can write on it, but what if the carpenter can't read? Or what if not he but the helmsman finds the hat? But there's no other way out. I took off my tunic and, standing on tiptoe, pressed my shoulder to the sharp end of the nail and drove it into my body. I waited patiently until I felt my shoulder was wet with blood, moving away. I dipped the wet chip and clearly wrote out, as I had been taught, I, Eupolion, son of Basileus, Telestes. The end of the chip dried up, and my shoulder also became dry. I squeezed the wound with my fingers, and squeezed out a few more drops of blood, and again the chip began drawing letters. I was captured by bandits. Save me. Above, the axes stopped ringing. I heard the carpenter's familiar voice. We'll start at dawn tomorrow. If the work goes like this, the helmsman responded. You'll finish in 3 days. Maybe we will. The carpenter agreed. The work isn't immediately visible, but I have masts in reserve. Then tell your brother to bring the oil jars closer. When you finish, we'll load up. The voices moved away. I put the hat on my head and began to wait. Time dragged unbearably long. Probably the helmsman had gone ashore and forgotten that I hadn't been fed today. But then I heard footsteps. No, it wasn't the helmsman. One of the crew with a bowl in his hands. He made a sign that I could go out on deck. The fresh air made me dizzy. I took the bowl and sat on a log they were going to make into a mast. But before I started eating, I took off the hat and, placing it on a pile of wood shavings, bent down and began whispering the first words that came to mind. The Phoenician watching me showed not a shadow of surprise. Prayer is a common thing. Pretending to pray, I secretly determined the distance from the ship to shore. Now the mountain with the snowy peak wasn't visible. Coastal hills blocked it. No city or settlement was visible either. Probably it was in a bay. also hidden by hills. Then I began to eat, trying to chew the food as long as possible. The Phoenician didn't take his eyes off me, but didn't rush me either. Having eaten, I gave the bowl to the guard and returned to the ladder. The Phoenician didn't notice the hat I had taken off. Half the job is done, I thought as I returned to my little room. The next day I listened to the sounds coming from the deck. Work was probably going full steam ahead. The Phoenicians were helping the carpenters, and I didn't interest them. So the carpenter picked up the hat, I thought. Or maybe the Phoenicians just threw it in the water, or nobody noticed it and it's just lying under the shavings. The helmsman himself brought me lunch. Besides the cakes, there were several apples on a clay plate. I couldn't hide my satisfaction, of course. It wasn't the apples that made me happy. They were evidence that the Phoenicians hadn't found the hat yet. Behave yourself, the helmsman said, leaving the plate. We'll go to sea soon, and you'll be able to go out on deck whenever you want. Late in the evening they brought me out on deck. The hat was nowhere to be seen. I seemed to be playing, rummaging through the shavings. The Phoenician who didn't take his eyes off me made no comment, apparently thinking that after the stinking hold it was pleasant to breathe the scents of the forest. The hat wasn't found under the shavings. Now I have to wait for tomorrow. I thought, tomorrow everything will be decided. At the Phoenician sign I obediently went down to the hold, entered the little room. The Phoenician locked the door with a bolt. All night I tossed on my bed. Behind the wooden wall the helmsman slept happily, not knowing what the next day would bring him. And it began with running around the deck and chopping. Probably they were installing the mast, and the help of the whole crew was needed. Then, after a short break, they knocked and ran again. They were installing the yards, and after some time I heard the sound of oars hitting water. The ship was being brought to shore, probably to take on oil jars that the helmsman had arranged for with a carpenter, or to take new rowers aboard. Only then could those who had found the hat and read what was written on it take advantage. The gangway crashed down. Planks creaked under the feet of loaders. Blows on deck. Probably they were placing oil jars on deck in a row. Nothing indicated that someone was going to free me. Silver jingled. The helmsman was paying the oil merchant, and when I had not a shadow of hope left, loud cries and sounds of fighting began. The clang of iron. Something heavy falling on deck. Someone was chasing someone across the deck and catching up. Someone was being dragged down. I ran to the door and began kicking it. And then someone heard me and was coming down. Coming to the door, looking for the bolt. And then the door opened, and I found myself in the arms of a bearded Hellene. Another moment, and I was on deck. It was all strewn with fragments from the jars, but there was no trace of spilled oil. Several Hellenes ran across the deck. At the stern, 2 more were bandaging a wounded man. Where are they? I asked, looking around. My rescuer pointed down. They're already tied to the oars. So quickly? Our Hellenic cleverness, he smiled. The Phoenicians themselves brought us onto the deck. We were in the jars instead of oil. I clapped my hands with joy. What a clever plan. What brave people. The ship, jumping on the waves, raced like a spirited horse. The sails cracked in the following wind. I stood at the bow next to the Phoenician god called Melkart. I learned this not from the bandits, but from the Sicilians. Melkart didn't help the Phoenicians because they were treacherous, and let the god remain in his place, while they are below, chained to oars. Now the sun smiles on me. The sea sparkles for me. Of course, without the carpenter who picked up my nurse's hat, and without the one who thought of putting warriors in the jars, victory would have been impossible. But I, Eupolion, wrote the letter, and I promised Poseidon white bulls. Poseidon will receive what was promised as soon as I set foot on Corinth's soil, embrace my father and sister, and tell them about everything I've experienced. And for now I can walk on deck as much as I want, and if I wish, go down to the rowers and take the whip. Because now I'm the master, and they are slaves. But strangely, I didn't want to take the whip at all. Remembering the suffering of that rower, with the black cross on his back, I felt not malicious joy, but some strange pity. Couldn't people live without slavery, without constant fear of the whip? However, These were still just childish thoughts. The main thing was that I was free and returning home, to my beloved father and dear sister Eurydice. Ahead was a meeting with relatives who had probably already mourned me as dead, and I knew that when I stepped on the shore of my native Corinth, I would become a different person, not just a Basileus' son, but one who had gone through trials and understood the price of freedom. The wind filled the sails, and the ship carried me home, to where love and peace awaited me. But in my heart I now carried not only the joy of return, but also pain for all those who were not destined to see their native shores. When I finally returned to Corinth and embraced my father, who met me with tears in his eyes, I realized that my adventures had changed me forever. I was no longer that carefree boy who ran along the shore asking his nurse to buy him a toy. I had seen cruelty and mercy, meanness and nobility. I now knew what it meant to fear for one's own life, and the joy of rescue. I had learned the price of freedom and the bitterness of losing a loved one. My dear nurse Misa would never again tell me tales about the Golden Fleece and the adventures of heroes, but her love and care remained forever in my heart, and the little white hat she had sewn with her own hands became a symbol of her eternal care for me. My father proudly listened to the story of how I managed to save myself, but in his eyes I also saw sadness for the dead nurse. Eurydice cried when she learned of Misa's fate, and wouldn't let me out of her arms for a long time. I brought Poseidon the promised bulls, thanking him for my rescue. But along with this I gained a deep understanding that the world is much more complex than it had seemed before. I learned that slaves are also people who suffer and dream of freedom, that pirates become evil not from birth, but because of life's difficult circumstances, that courage and intelligence can overcome brute force, and love and loyalty are more precious than all the treasures in the world. When I grew up and became Basileus myself, I tried to rule justly, remembering that every person has the right to dignity and respect, and I told the story of my adventures to my grandchildren, so they would know. Even in the most difficult trials, one must not lose hope and humanity. Thus ended my first great adventure, an adventure that taught me to be a true human being,